The Shadow Minister for Climate Change and Energy, Mark Butler, joins us to discuss this issue on the line from Adelaide. Mark Butler, good morning and welcome. You've been talking about a emissions intensity scheme being needed to ensure new investment in the power sector. For the uninitiated, can you just take us through what an EIS actually is?
Well, essentially it's a very strong signal to investors about a commitment by the national government to see new generation capacity built in Australia that is as clean as possible. It's not just Labor that's been talking about this. We picked this up from the Energy Markets Commission, which came up with the concept in 2015. This is the body that oversees the national electricity market. And over the course of the last several weeks of last year, you saw it recommended by the Chief Scientist, by the Climate Change Authority, by all state governments, Labor and Liberal alike, and by the industry itself, along with the CSIRO. So pretty much everyone who has focused some attention on future energy policy has come up with the idea that this emissions intensity scheme, as I said, not a creature of the Labor Party's thinking, but an idea from the Energy Markets Commission, is the proper centrepiece of a national modernisation plan for electricity. Now, just before Christmas, Josh Frydenberg, the Energy Minister, indicated that the federal government would be thinking about adopting this, and that's a good thing because it would be then there would then be the possibility finally of some bipartisan national energy policy. But after a very strong reaction from the right wing of his own party, Tony Abbott, Cory Bernardi and the like, Malcolm Turnbull inexplicably and very foolishly, I think, decided to walk away from the emissions intensity scheme, in spite of the fact that the Energy Markets Commission said that a failure to introduce this scheme would cost households $15 billion in increased power bills over the next decade.
Well, you mentioned this wasn't a creation of the Labor Party, and in fact, if we do go back in history to when this was first put forward in 2009 by the economist Danny Price, in a report commissioned by the now Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull and Senator Nick Xenophon, your colleague Penny Wong described it as a mongrel. She said it wasn't a credible alternative, it's a smokescreen and has the distinct taste of magic pudding. Why should we believe you that it's the way forward now?
Well, over the course of 2015 and 16, I spent some months consulting very deeply with the energy industry, with consumers, with businesses that are big users of energy, mostly our manufacturing sector. And we came to the view that the proper thing to do was to adopt a comprehensive plan that looked at building new renewable energy to replace our ageing coal fleet, 3/4 of which is operating beyond its design life, and an emissions intensity scheme which was a policy that we thought had the best chance of gaining a consensus between the major parties, but also with the electricity industry, the old thermal generators, so the coal and gas-fired generators, but also the new renewable energy industry and the big energy users. And I think things were looking good into early December last year that finally we might have a bipartisan energy policy that had the support of all of the state governments, Labor and Liberal alike, the support of the industry, the support of big energy users, and finally send a strong investment signal to businesses that would allow them to start building the new generation that Australia is going to need over the next couple of decades. Because I think it's often lost, Nick, in the debate that 3/4 of our coal and gas-fired generators around the country are already operating beyond their design life. It's not a matter of choice about replacing them. Inevitably, they will close over the next decade or decade and a half. And even if there wasn't this debate about climate change or a renewable energy revolution, Australia would anyway be now at the position in its history of having to renew all of those generators that were built mainly in the 1960s and 1970s. But unless the investment community has a strong signal from the National Parliament and the national government that preferably is bipartisan, they're simply not going to build that. And what you'll see as a result, as Danny Price said only just before Christmas, you'll see less energy security, so more blackouts and brownouts, and increasing power prices for households and businesses. And only a couple of weeks into January, we're already seeing that.
I suppose the big question is, what are you going to replace those ageing coal plants with? You spoke about gas. We've seen big hikes in gas prices at the moment, with a number of state governments putting bans and moratoriums on exploration. Isn't the reality here that if we're to meet our Paris climate change targets, we're going to have to pay more?
Well, what we do need to do is build a new generation of generators, a new fleet of generators across the country that is as diverse and as clean and modern as possible. Now, we'd like those to be new, modern, renewable energy generators as far as possible, but gas is going to have to be a very important part of our mix for a considerable period of time. We don't think that there is any appetite in the investment community to build new coal-fired generators, although I did notice that the Resources Minister in the Turnbull government last week said that his preference was for Australia to build new coal-fired generators. So I think this is the sort of discussion we need to have with the business community, particularly those parts that are going to fund these new generators. But they're not going to do it if they don't have a very clear signal from their national government, the sort of signal that I thought we were going to get with an emissions intensity scheme.
We have one state which already has a pretty high gas and renewable energy mix, and that's your home state of South Australia, and we've got the highest wholesale prices in the nation there and statewide blackouts. Is this a portent of things to come for the rest of the country?
Well, I think it's important to separate exactly what has happened over the last 12 months, Nick, and as I think you know, there was a statewide blackout that all of the energy market operators and the experts in the field have said was clearly the product of a once in a 100-year storm that blew down 23 transmission towers. It wasn't about the nature of the generation fleet. The chief scientist said at a summit in South Australia a week or so after that blackout that this sort of thing would have happened even if there were a much higher reliance on gas and coal-fired generators than there is in South Australia. So let's be clear about what happened with that statewide blackout. But it is true that South Australia is at the pointy end of this transition to a modern 21st century fleet of generators, and South Australia has been very badly let down by the lack of strong national energy policy. First of all, as I said, a strong investment signal of the type that Danny Price and the CSIRO and so many others have talked about getting from an emissions intensity scheme, but also we have utter chaos in our gas market. Because of the new LNG operators operating out of Queensland, sending gas off to Korea and to China and to Japan, we've seen a tripling of demand in the eastern market for gas, and we're simply not getting enough gas supply into our electricity generators that are keeping prices down. So the price spikes you've seen over the last 12 months in places like South Australia, but elsewhere in the national electricity market as well, are overwhelmingly the product of very big spikes in the price of gas. And we've seen nothing over the last 3 years from the Turnbull and the Abbott government to really introduce some sort of order into a gas market that's profoundly different after the introduction of those LNG export operations.